right, we've had a couple of people request some more help when starting their 10-stitch blanket. So I'm going to do a quick video on how to end the center circle and then start your first little wedge that will go out into the 10-stitch. Let me show you on my sample blanket what part I'm talking about. This center section, finishing this center pie and starting right here, you'll start with 1 stitch and you slowly increase to 10 stitches. So this is the part I'm going to show you on this video, is this section right here, how to go from 1 stitch back to 10. I've just done a few pie pieces. I haven't done the full amount of pie pieces. I've just done a few just to get the pie started, and I finished a pie piece. There's all these little pie pieces and you just continue on. You'd want this a little fuller. As I did these pie pieces, I did a slip stitch edge, so I have a nice edge here on the outer edge of the pie pieces that I can attach the next section to. So let me pull up my pattern here. I'm to the section on the pattern where I finished all the pie pieces, and it says to knit 1 row and then cast off 9 stitches. So that's where I'm at in the pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with what the pattern calls for. It says to knit 1 row. So I'm always slipping my first stitch. I'm going to go into the stitch as if to purl with my yarn in front, and I'm just going to slip the first stitch. Then I'm going to pull the yarn back to the back, and now that's going to count as 1 stitch. Even though I didn't work it, I only slipped it. So I'm going to knit the first row, knit 1 row. So there's 1. I'm going to knit these 10 stitches. 2, 9, and that's my very last stitch. It's a little bit tight. There's my 10 stitches. I knitted 1 row. Now I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to cast off 9 stitches. So I'm going to knit 2 and cast off the first one. I'm going to knit another one. I do have other videos if you're interested in learning how to cast off. This video, I'm assuming that you already know how to cast off, so I'm not going to slow down to show you that part. I'm just going to continue casting off 9 stitches. So I should have 1 stitch left on my needle. Next, the pattern says to increase by doing a knit into the front and the back. So I'm going to do a knit into the front and then reach around and put your needle back in to the back leg and knit the back leg. So I now have 2 stitches, and then I can take that stitch off the left needle. So now I have 2 stitches instead of just 1. We're going to start increasing our stitches back to 10, and at the same time we're going to be joining them here along this edge. So now the instructions for getting back to the 10 stitches says ridge 1, knit 1, join, knit 1. So I'm going to slip my first stitch rather than knit it. So I pull it over and then bring my yarn to the back. That's my 1 stitch. Now I'm going to do a join. So I'm going to do a simple join, and I slip that stitch. I'm going to go into this very first stitch on this edge. You can see the little holes underneath the slipped stitch. I'm going to go into the very first one, and I'm going to pull a stitch through. So I'm going to wrap my needle and bring that stitch through, and then I'm going to take the slipped stitch, that middle stitch, and get my needle up underneath there, and I'm going to cast it off. So I've just joined the round, and then I'm going to turn my needle over and knit all the way back to the beginning. Now the instructions say knit one, join, knit one, and I don't understand how that can happen because I have 2 stitches. So I'm just going to knit 2 stitches back to the beginning. And then we're going to start doing our increases. So I have 2 stitches. I've joined our work because we went into the very first stitch at the top and we knit back. So we've done 1 ridge. Down and back is 1 ridge. Now I'm ready to start increasing to get back up to 10. Now I'm going to work ridge 2. It says to knit into the front and back, join, and knit 2. Okay, here's how I'm going to do it because it makes more sense to me to do it this way. It says to knit into the front and back of the first stitch, but I always want to slip my first stitch. So I'm going to slip my first stitch, bring the yarn to the back, and then I'm going to make a new stitch. I'm going to do an M1 rather than a knit into the front and the back. I'm going to pull this little loop up and put it on my needle, and I'm going to knit into the back leg of it. I'm again going to assume you already know how to work an M1. It can be kind of tricky, but I've got my needle into the back loop, and I'm going to knit that stitch. So now I have 2 stitches where I just had 1. I just did an increase. So I'm doing the same thing that the pattern calls for, but I find this easier. So I slipped 1, I made a new stitch, and now I'm going to work the join. So I slip the stitch before the join, I slip it over. I'm going to go into the next hole. There's holes right there. I'm going to go into the next hole, and I'm going to bring a stitch through the hole, and then I cast off that slipped stitch. I take and grab it with my needle and cast it off. Now I have 3 stitches. Then I turn my work, and I'm going to knit back to the beginning. So I'm doing my increases just a little different than the pattern calls for, and you can certainly make whatever changes you want to make. But I'm doing it this way because I want to maintain my slipped stitch outside edge. So now I have 3 stitches, and I'm going to go on to the next ridge. The next ridge is ridge 3, knit 2, join, knit 2. So I'm going to slip my first stitch, which counts as 1, knit my second stitch. Now I'm going to join, which means I'm going to pull that stitch over. I'm going to go into the next hole, which is right there. Go into the next hole, pull a stitch through, and cast off the slipped stitch. Now I have 3 stitches. I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to knit back on those 3 stitches. This does differ from what the pattern calls for, and maybe that's why everybody who has worked this sometimes has problems. I can totally understand why this would not make sense. I turn my work back around. I have 3 stitches. Now I'm going to, in my next ridge, I'm going to do an increase. And again, I don't want to do the increase on my first stitch because I want that to be a slip stitch. So I'm going to add a stitch right here in the middle, right here. So it says to knit into the front and back, knit 1, join, knit 3. And here's how I'm going to do it. Slip my first stitch, yarn in back. I could do 2 things here actually. I could either pick up the bar underneath and make a new stitch, or I could do a knit into the front and back of the next stitch. As long as I leave this stitch ready for the join, I can put a new stitch here or I can put a new stitch here. Doesn't matter. So I've slipped my first stitch. I could do a knit into the front and the back of this stitch, and then do my join, which is slip it, go into the next hole, bring the yarn through, and then cast off the slipped stitch. Now I have 4 stitches. I'm going to knit back. I've done mine a little differently. I hope it hasn't confused you more, but you can really work your increases wherever you want to. I always want to maintain that slip stitch on the edge. So now I am ready for ridge 5. I've decided to split this video up into 2 sections because it's getting kind of long. So please look for part 2 of this lesson and we'll pick up right where we left off here.